Hello and welcome to my latest episode on dyeing speckled yarn, and I'm also going to be dyeing a non-superwash merino yarn in green, and that's what I've just popped into the pot just now. That is 0.5 grams of Kelly green and 0.5 grams of gunmetal from Jacquard acid dyes. I've got two pots now, so the one on the right is just a standard crock pot. I can't remember the litres, I think it's about 25. And then the one on the left is a full-sized catering pan made by Vogue. And that was fairly inexpensive. But what I've done here is just popped some water in both of these. And you'll see I've just dropped the yarn into the dye for the kettle dyeing. And then the pan on the left is going to be for my speckles. So here I've just popped in a very small amount, 0.1 grams of the chestnut colour, again in Jacquard acid dyes, and look at that lovely colour that's appeared there, mix of reds and browns, absolutely beautiful. And I'm hoping to get a light colour that I will then speckle over with different colours. The colours that I want to speckle are scarlet, magenta, olive, and a bit of the chestnut, again just to bring out the brown in the colourway there. I'm going to be dyeing 3 different skeins of yarn here. So one is superwash merino nylon, 75% 25%, your fairly standard superwash merino nylon for socks, 100% merino, and that's also superwash, and then the last one is 100% BFL. And I've also got some mini skeins to pop in to soak up a bit of the colour and just create some minis that will be similar to the full skeins. So yeah, to begin with, I have a fair amount of water in the pots. I think it's about 3 litres in each of those pots. The one on the left, the long pan, is really great for speckling because it means that I can spread the yarn out. So that's why I opted to get one of those. Whereas it's a lot harder to speckle yarn in a round pot because your yarn is kind of all curled up. So yeah, you can see on the left there, the colour is very much going a really light shade of pink, and I love the variation in it. So some kind of lighter parts and some parts which are more of a browny pink and a bit darker. Reminds me a bit of my ballet shoes when I was younger, actually. And then the one on the right is going in a lovely shade of green. The reason that I'm testing this out today is that I am trying out some colours for a friend of mine who is making a sweater and wants me to dye some specific non-superwash yarn for her. There's a mini just going in just over the top to see what kind of light colours it will pull from the water there. Talk a bit about safety. I am wearing a mask and goggles and gloves throughout this, except in certain situations where I don't necessarily need gloves to pick up the yarn. That's to stop me from breathing or getting the dye in my eyes, because the dye powder is very fine and can damage your lungs if you inhale too much. I also have the extractor fan on full at this point and the window wide open in my kitchen, and I don't use any of these pots for food afterwards. They are strictly for yarn dyeing only. That goes for any spoons or any tools that I use for the yarn dyeing process as well. My aim with the speckles is just to get a really light speckle, and I haven't been successful at that before. But a video I watched recently of Kay Jones from the Bakery Bears trying some speckles out has inspired me to give a paintbrush a go, so we'll see what result that has. At the moment I'm just removing some water from the pan on the left, because in order for the speckles to set really well, you need to have a very low level of water. So whilst I wanted to dye all of the skeins fully in the light colour, albeit with a bit of variation. I want to make sure that the speckles are just speckling in one small area and not spreading out massively. So I'm just removing some of the water to reduce that level. For all of these skeins that I've put into the pots, I've soaked them for half an hour in a vat of water with a bit of citric acid in it, and that's the mordant I use that then sets the yarn with the colour. I'll also be adding some citric acid as we go occasionally, just to allow it to soak in and top up the water with that acidic solution. In fact, that's what I'm going to do now. Now I'm going to start actually speckling the yarn. So here I've picked up some of the scarlet colour, and what I'm doing is picking a little bit, an absolutely tiny bit up from the pot with the paintbrush, and brushing it against a piece of kitchen towel just to kind of spray the specks of dye powder over the top of the existing yarn, the dyed yarn. And as you can see, it seems to be working very well at the moment. I think in future, rather than using kitchen towel, I'll use something like the chopstick that you'll see me using later on, just to have something hard and washable that I can use rather than having to throw away a piece of kitchen towel later on. So in hindsight, it makes sense to use something that I can then wash and reuse later on rather than something to throw away. But yeah, I'm finding that this technique seems to be very successful. I'm getting some pretty clear speckles, although the scarlet itself does sort of run a little bit when it hits the water. So perhaps I've got a bit too much water in there to make some really defined specks with it, but hopefully the result is absolutely perfect anyway. Then I'm just stirring the pot on the kettle dyed yarn just to make sure that the green covers as much as possible, although I am intending to have some variation through different colours because I really like the way that that looks, and it makes it look much more hand dyed as far as I am concerned when it comes to actually using the skein in the end. The next thing I'll need to do with the speckles is actually flip the yarn over so that I can cover the other side with the specks. But what I'm doing now is just tapping to make sure that the speckles are setting, so tapping it with an old chopstick to see if the colour spreads when I tap it, and if it doesn't, then it's all good to go and I can flip the yarn over. Another little stir. You can see there that the dye pot actually has essentially exhausted all of the dye, so we're looking good on the green yarn. Here I'm starting to speckle my other colour, which is the pink, and that actually looks quite bright relative to the red so far, but I imagine once it's actually finished up, those colours will be much more muted, as that often happens when you're dyeing yarn. As you let the yarn dry, it kind of lightens. Now that my yarn on this side is looking lovely and bubbling away, it's time to flip it back over and do the pink colour on the other side. And then once I've done that, I can move on to doing the final colour, which is the olive. You can see on the very right hand side of the pan there, I've got my mini skein that's capturing a little bit of the speckles, but it's still very, very light coloured, and that's because I put it in so late with the other yarns. What I wanted to do with it was actually get a bit of that kind of pinky brown colour, but it looks like that was soaked up so quickly by the other yarns that there wasn't any left for the mini skein. However, what I'll do later on is add in a bit of the chestnut to the end of the pan, and I've got a couple of other minis to add in as well to pick up that lovely browny tinge, and then we'll see what that looks like with the speckles first and then the kind of chestnut brown colour over the top. Now that I'm onto the olive colour, you can really see some of those specks starting to appear as a really lovely contrast to the red and the pink in the yarn, which I think is really lovely, and we'll see how those turn out when the yarn is dry. At the moment they look quite stark, but I'm hoping that you'll see a bit more of the olivey green colour come through at the end. That I have to do is remove the yarn from the tray and then pop the skeins into a bowl to be rinsed out, just to make sure that there isn't any bleeding, and also just to clear the yarn of that acid water. Then finally, after that, what I'll do is clean the yarn with some wool wash, so soak it for 10 minutes with a wool wash called Eucalan that I absolutely love, and then squeeze them out in a towel and let them dry. What I'm doing next is just adding some dye to the water with those mini skeins that I mentioned. So you've got the mini skein that had just the speckling over the top of the white, which actually looks really pretty, to be honest. But I'm going to just over dye it with some of that light chestnut, and do the same for those other two plain coloured mini skeins that I had lying on the side, all soaked and ready to dye, but I hadn't popped them in yet. Hello, I hope you've enjoyed watching my yarn dyeing adventure and experiment with speckles today. So I just wanted to show you what the dyeing actually achieved as a final result, just because you saw the yarn in the pot rather than finished up. So looking at the speckled yarn first, this is what it looks like in the skein. And I dyed 3 different skeins of yarn. So this one is 75-25 merino nylon. I also dyed up a skein of Blueface Leicester. Again, this is superwash as well, but 100% Blueface Leicester. And then the third one I dyed was 100% superwash merino yarn. So this is how it looks on the 75-25 in the skein, and I think it's achieved a really lovely result. So I'm so glad I tried that technique with the paintbrush and something just to brush against. It seems to have really worked in terms of the speckles. You can see up here you've got some speckles of different colours, and I think this is a really beautiful kind of antique rose colourway, so I'm actually calling it dried petals because I think that's what that reminded me of. The BFL looks a little bit more subtle, I think, so it's fairly obvious when I look at it that this is a more woolly wool than the merino one. I was actually quite concerned that I might have felted it, but yeah, that looks really pretty as well. So just to go over what I did specifically, I dyed this in a very tiny amount of chestnut colourway in the jacquard acid dyes to begin with. Then what I did was I speckled some of the chestnut, some scarlet, and some, I think it's magenta, but I'll double check on that. And finally some olive brown, which I think is actually adding a little bit of green. In fact, you'll see I did a big splotch there. So I think that added golden green colour looks really nice with the pinks and the reds. So yeah, really happy with that. This is the Superwash Merino 100% one. But you probably can't tell too much on the camera, but it does look really, really lovely. I like this section here because you've got quite a lot of the different colours. You've got a bit of the olive. It goes all the way up. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how this knits up. I'm probably going to give away or sell 2 out of 3 of these, so I'll see which one I keep. But it might be something like the 100% merino, because I might do a shawl with it and see what happens. But yeah, overall really happy with the result of that. Really glad I tried the paintbrush technique that was recommended by Kay of the Bakery Bears. So very pleased with that. You'll have seen that I put in a couple of mini skeins as well. So 2 of them just had the chestnut colourway on them, so the really, really light coloured chestnut. And I think it looks lovely actually. It's kind of a very, very light pinky brown. So I'm just definitely going to have some of that again. I might see what happens when I dye it darker. And then this one here was the one that I put in with the rest. So here you go. So it does have some specks of different colours, which looks really, really nice. I don't know what I'll use this for, but I'll see what happens. So yeah, one of these, this one's DK, and then the other 2 are fingering weight skeins. It's showing you how the green turned out. So this one was 50% or 0.5 grams of Kelly green and 0.5 grams of gunmetal, which is a bluey grey. So I thought it would come out in a really nice green, and it definitely has. So the Kelly green is quite a kind of limey green, I would say, which means mixing it with the bluey grey has given it this really varied kind of spring green colour, but slightly bluey. So let me give you a close-up of that. There you go. And that was a total of 1 gram of dye. So yeah, I think I'm calling this spring green actually as a colour. Yeah, this was on non-superwash fingering weight yarn as a tester for a friend of mine who wants a sweater's quantity dyed up. But yeah, I do think this is really, really pretty as a green, so I'll definitely be repeating that. And then to soak up some of the rest of the colour, I did pop a couple of mini skeins in. So let me do the same as before. And that was the result, just to soak up the remainder. And it's a really kind of light eucalyptus colour, I would say. Also really, really pretty. So I'll be using this mini skein in some heels probably. And that's it. So I really hope you enjoyed watching me give more dyeing a go and succeed in speckling yarn. I will see you next week for a full episode. Thank you very much for watching, and please like and subscribe. That really improves my visibility. Bye, have a lovely crafty couple of weeks.